your future.
Good day, students. I am Fitzgerald H. Bendelsmith, and today we'll continue our deep dive into the world of Atlas. For those new to our channel, Atlas is the code name for this version of 19th century Earth, where our series, The Association of Ishtar, takes place, an alternate reality history filled with cosmic mystery and steampunk adventure. In the last video we discussed the world's first space program known as the Babylon Project, created by a science mogul called Ghulam Ali, and his quest to set the first man on the mysterious Elysium object. Ali did not start his illustrious career with the space program, however, but the Académie d'Aéronautique in Paris, founded by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte himself, a state-funded institute for scientific advancement that developed the famous R2 rockets that the Empire used to terrorize the cities of Great Britain. Today we'll be discussing the origins and consequences of this anachronistic technology and how this led to the creation of an organization called the International Regulatory Committee of Rift-Related Activities, better known as REAM. As the name implies, it's a regulatory organization that monitors and enforces international treaties in matters associated with anomalous phenomena and illicit rift-related activities. After hearing that, you might think, wow, that is really vague, and that is by design, because that is what REAM is, an ad hoc creation to resolve an undefined problem. But how could that have happened? In the course of several lectures, we'll discuss REAM's purpose, the context from which it arose, and how the situation stands in the year of our Lord, 1875. For that we return to the year of 1814, and how it all went downhill from there. Our story starts during the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, after being defeated in 1812, was exiled to Elba, where he got to be emperor in the island's only city. And that he did, quite successfully in fact. But all that peace bored him quickly, and after 2 years he made his plans to escape. But as he headed off to spread joy elsewhere, he left the island in a better state than that he found it. Fun fact, the island still flies the flag Napoleon designed. While the emperor was in exile, the Allied powers were dividing the war spoils in a series of meetings now known as the Congress of Vienna that lasted from 1814 to 1815. The ink on the agreement had barely dried when Napoleon returned from his exile to bring France back under his control. In June of the same year, the meat grinder known as the Battle of Waterloo transpired, breaking Napoleon's army for good and exiling the emperor a second time to a rock in the middle of the ocean called St. Helena. And there was much rejoicing. Now the boogeyman might be gone, but the coalition's troubles were far from over. Now they had the emperor's legacy to contend with. The goal of the Vienna Congress was to establish a new status quo in Europe. As with the great many wars before, this one was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And this peace would satisfy all of Europe's nations. There was a conundrum, however. The relationship between the four estates had shifted severely. What these diplomats failed to acknowledge was that European societies had changed. French occupation had inflamed the fires of nationalism and other ideologies. Before the dawn of the 19th century, somebody came from a city or a region. You are French because you spoke French. However, after the American and French revolutions, people started to identify with their nation, which changed how the average citizen thought about their respective governments. It made the populace question the purpose of government and how it ought to relate to the nation. The concept of nationhood was something that the French exported to countries whose monarchies had been crushed. Ideas about communities and citizenship weren't new, but the concept that the people inside a unified border had a shared destiny, that was a novel concept for those times. Based on these concepts, new countries were created, like the Kingdom of the Netherlands and Poland. However, within that idea lurked the assumption people could be seduced into taking on national identities, such as Flemish could be turned into Dutch and Basques could be turned into Spanish, despite their prior history, culture, and religious convictions. This is why minority groups were often forced to learn the languages of the dominant cultures, just to name a policy. Let's not even speak of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, where minority groups realized they didn't enjoy being ruled by foreigners who didn't even speak their language. Ergo, the Congress of Vienna set out to satisfy the needs of those in power, like appointing one of Napoleon's cousins, the King of the Netherlands. Yeah, that's a thing. I know I will not get into that today, but while these technocrats were drawing out the lines of their utopia, the national needs were neglected. Post-Napoleon Europe was all about reconciliation. The wars of coalition had to be the final conflict, in Europe at least, as imperial expansion in the overseas territories continued unabated. Enter Austrian Minister Clemens Wenzel Metternich, aka the Coachman of Europe. Under his watchful eye, a new status quo was to be established that would guarantee everlasting peace on the continent. During the Congress of Vienna, a new balance of power was established among the Big Five of Europe: Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, Austria, and of course, France. The negotiations would be established on the basis of three guiding principles: restoration, legitimacy, and compensation. And that sounds absolutely reasonable. However, there was a big flaw in their thinking. Metternich was considered a pioneer of what historians and political analysts would call political realism. A belief that states are self-interested and obsessed with power. From this perspective, ideology was just a cover for their ambitions like, I don't know, the French Wars of Revolution and the British War on Slavery. Thus, to ensure peace, the interest of the aforementioned Big Five had to be catered to in order to create a balance of power that would make war too big of a risk to engage in. The problem with this way of thinking was that it assumed the Big Five would be the most powerful nations now and forever. I think Spain would have something to say about that. In their view, Napoleon disrupted this balance that maintained the peace, thus causing conflict after conflict. Metternich, on the other hand, became the director of the so-called Concert of Europe, promoting harmony, harmony between the Big Five, that is. Thus, the status quo was supposed to restore the pre-war situation, which had to be maintained at all cost. In this context, the minor nations were but game tokens to be divided up between the various spheres of influence. For example, the just restored Kingdom of Poland was made subservient to the Russian Tsar. The Netherlands was to annex Belgium to serve as a buffer between Great Britain, France, and Prussia, and Swiss had been declared neutral. But more on that later. What these diplomats failed to acknowledge was that European society had changed. Due to the rise of nationalism, no longer did the citizens identify with feudal lords of old, but a shared language and place of birth. The people started to believe in national myths and heritage, convincing them they were part of something greater, an ongoing project that the citizens, their ancestors, and their children would be part of. Thus they demanded representation and social reforms to benefit its citizenry, rather than the state. Traumatized by the violence of the French and American revolutions, the ruling elite and disciples of Metternich became hell-bent on crushing these grassroots movements. Thus, what followed was a circle of revolts and repression in a bid for power by various factions, for better or worse. Focused on maintaining the concert of Europe and colonial expansion, Napoleon's technological legacy became an afterthought, and that was eventually neglected. While politicians were preoccupied with civil unrest and revolutionary fervor, the 1820s and 1830s were rife with technological innovation. Ishtar released its first wavecasters, bringing live music in the living rooms of the common households. Faraday perfected the electric motor by 1825, and by 1835 James Bowman Lindsay patented the incandescent Lindsay lamp, to name but a few innovations that would change public life forever. Nobody questioned the sudden surge of technological innovations. On the contrary, the R2 rocket, Napoleon's terror weapon, became an object of reverence rather than fear, thanks to the efforts of Ghulam Ali and companies like Ishtar. Amidst the political unrest, there was an optimism that technology could solve all of humanity's problems. But nobody questioned how these leaps in technological advancements had come about. That was about to change. In the 1850s, something happened that would shake the foundations of how people perceived the world. Literally. In the countryside of northern Spain, when rural communities were preparing a festival, celebrating the first harvest after years of bloody civil war, they had an unexpected guest. The ground trembled when a monstrous behemoth trampled farmland and communities under its tree-sized hooves. It took an artillery group to kill the beast. The worst thing of it all, it wasn't some bloodthirsty demon from the pages of Revelation, but a starving herbivore looking for lands to graze in a world in which it was not meant to exist. Upon investigation, the origins of the beast had been discovered. An anomaly, a preternatural portal that led all who traversed it to a savage world filled with beasts bigger than was assumed possible. And there was nothing to be done about this anomaly. These rifts, as these portals became to be known, were here to stay, allowing more such tragedies to occur. As news about the rifts spread among the ruling elite, it didn't take long for the Allies to put one and one together and come to the conclusion Napoleon hadn't just discovered some artifacts in the Egyptian desert that would inspire the invention of the R2 rockets, but entire worlds. Before this incident, governments were too preoccupied to care about strange anomalies and cryptid sightings. But after the discovery, the problems could no longer be ignored. The incident may have been kept out of the media. There were pressing concerns that needed to be addressed. First, the rifts. Second, the method used by the artillery group to take down the behemoth. This involved an illicit stash of Napoleon's weapons, abandoned during the Peninsula War, high-explosive shells decades ahead of their time, and without it, the artillery group wouldn't have been able to kill the creature. This led to passionate discussions on how to counter such future incursions. Despite being a threat to their precious balance of power, reverse-engineered weapons needed to be developed, produced, and prepared for action. But who would operate these arsenals and under whose supervisions was a whole different discussion. Unsurprisingly, no nation trusted another with these futuristic weapon systems. But time was running out. Not only were more and more rifts being located, chaos was brewing on the fringes of everyday society. Although the public remained blissfully unaware, word of the rift spread throughout the underworld, from explorers traversing the rifts without permission to smugglers and cartographers selling these locations to the highest bidder. Moreover, there was the matter of the rogue scientist who used to be in Napoleon's employ developing these weapons, which were still out there somewhere. Throughout the 1850s, there were also more reports of rifts appearing, while mutual suspicion between the governments was ever increasing. Metternich, an old man by then, was struggling to direct his orchestra, and there was only one man who could help him. And that man was a diplomat from Zurich called Henrik Lazare. And he will be the subject of our next lecture. So stay tuned for our next presentation on RA. But before we leave, by the time this goes out, our next crowdfunding, The Casket Girls, will be in pre-launch. It's the first issue in a new spin-off series about mechs, monsters and maidens set inside this universe. Please help us reach 100 followers and we'll offer an alternate cover. We'll also have a lot of other cool stuff like this 3D printable steampunk mech and its pilots. And of course, if you want to read our short stories or support the series in general, you can follow us on REAM, where I post new short stories every week. Finally, I'd like to pay attention to these following creators who helped us create the original art and music score that were included in this video. Please check out their social media links in the description and give them your support. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, class dismissed.